I want Etan to introduce himself and tell us more about Martian and he has been up to so far.
Awesome. Thanks, Swagata, for having me. Great to be with everyone. And thanks for the kind intro. So yeah, why don't I kind of start with a little bit of background about myself, how I got interested in specifically Martian and in building companies more generally. And then I'll kind of talk about specifically what we're doing with Martian. So just for some background on myself, before Martian, I previously started two companies. I kind of got into entrepreneurship by accident. I was really obsessed with this show, American Ninja Warrior. It's now on NBC. It's like an obstacle course show that people run through and they complete all these like fitness challenges. And for me, I was originally in second grade and I was like, how do I get on this show? Which had an age limit. You had to be 21. And I had this idea, well, maybe I can start something that's so popular that they'll have to have me on the show because it'll just get like so much attention. So I had this idea of starting my own fan site where I tell people how to train for the show and stuff like that. And I basically turned that into an entire e-commerce business. It actually became like the first e-commerce platform for that show. I kind of think of American Ninja Warrior as like an underground sport, kind of like mixed martial arts that didn't have an ecosystem behind it. And kind of as a super fan, but then I started to kind of think about it like an entrepreneur. I saw all the different things that you could build around this, like selling blueprints, training tips, all kinds of stuff like that. And I even like scaled a bunch of gyms myself as like a consultant. So I got exposure to managing teams. I was an operator, things like that. And that's what really got me excited about building companies, and ran that from, starting out very young. And that's how I taught myself like web development. The first version of the site we made on like Microsoft Word, and I like saved it as an HTML, had no idea what I was doing. But by the end, I was, running this whole platform with like millions of users on it. And after that, I wanted to see what other trends I could catch. You mentioned like riding the wave. I feel like my goal is always to like catch the wave before it's formed and ride it from like the very beginning.
Right.
And so this was in like 2017. It was actually when I got into NLP, pre-transformer actually. And I had this idea of creating an algorithmic trading firm that was essentially using NLP as an investment strategy. So this became really popular with like Wall Street Bets, which was in, I think, 2020. So a few years later, where people were looking at like these indications of like social media data from Reddit and sources like that to see, what stocks should I invest in? What's popular? But we were kind of doing that same thing, this like quantitative trading algorithm, but a few years early and using NLP to power that. And I think one thing for me that I learned from that experience was I loved building companies and I saw tremendous promise in the NLP side of things, but I didn't think that just creating an investment firm was the right place to really devote my life to. And what I wanted to do is like, I think about myself as like, I want to build an extraordinary tower. I'd rather build one tower to the stars versus build a whole bunch of little towers. And so I want to be really deliberate about what that tower that I'm building to the stars is. And does it have a tremendous amount of meaning for me? And ultimately it wasn't that business. So I made the decision to actually go find another company. I ended up selling my stake in the company there, and I wanted to find like what was that other area that I could really see myself immersing myself into. And that's how I got really interested in generative AI and what became Martian. So I was interested in like, how do we create super intelligence? How do we make humans much smarter? And one of the first things I did was build applications of large language models. Particularly, I was building some of the first LLM-powered tutors, and actually had these tutors deployed in classes with like thousands of students. And this is actually how I met my co-founder. This was back in 2020, so a few years before ChatGPT really came into popularity. And so that's kind of how I got keyed in on generative AI and how fast these models had progressed in such a short amount of time from 2017 out to 2020. It was kind of like having like your ChatGPT moment, but a few years early. So that's really what got me interested in Martian. And one of the things that we observed was that there was huge differences in the performance, the cost of the different models that are out there. And you could get much better results if you knew which model to route each question to in like an intelligent way. So the way that I would describe Martian is we're building the Google for LLMs in the sense that there's so many models coming out there. I think a lot of people don't realize just how many there are. There's actually over 1 million open source models. And there's huge differences in the performance and the cost profiles of them. So like GPT-4 is 60 times more expensive than 3.5 Turbo. So you can imagine there's going to be cases where using GPT-4 would be so expensive, it would be like, it would completely destroy your unit economics. But there's also instances where you need a really expensive model like GPT-4, because if you don't, you're going to risk having a hallucination that could be really, really detrimental. There's a number of examples of this, of like chatbots that gave away a car for like $1, things like that. So balancing each of the different trade-offs of the different models and ensuring ensuring that you can get the highest possible quality at the lowest cost and lowest latency. That's really the core of what Martian is enabling.
Awesome, awesome. That's amazingly explained. So you talked about like your journey into Martian and how you kind of felt like this is the big tower that you want to build. And I see the potential of how it could be helpful. And apart from like the cost benefit that Martian gives, there's also like hallucination problem. There's also like ethical AI, which is becoming big these days, how to reduce bias and how to make sure there is no gender bias and all these kind of different ethical side of AI. And also as a consumer of these LLMs, I might have different requirements wherein I want more emotional, like an AI agent sort of thing. So for different kind of tasks. So does Martian, apart from cost, what other aspects or how can we customize these things like bias and even every user needs based on what kind of responses they want. So is there any customization scope that Martian offers?
Absolutely. Quality ultimately looks different for different use cases. So I often joke, if you're building like an AI girlfriend application, the responses that you're going to want to see are going to be very different from an enterprise customer service chatbot. So what works for one customer may not work for another customer. And especially that's a challenge when you have these big general purpose models, which can do so many different functionalities. So one of the core pieces of how Martian is designed is it's designed to be customized to each customer's particular requirements for quality. So we have a general purpose router that can work well in a number of different tasks, but the real value of the system comes from the ability to create a custom tuned router on your specific use case. So you can get the best possible results based on your definitions of quality. And we can allow this in a bunch of different ways. So we've done a lot of work ourselves building out evals. We have people from the team, for example, that were previously on the Google Bard team, previous tenured professors, a bunch of people at Microsoft and a lot of different companies who've really dove deep into the whole field of like model evaluation and AI research. So we've gotten very good at evaluating the quality of these models. And what we do is we often work in parallel with companies that are using the platform to align on the specific quality metrics they care about. Sometimes this is kind of like almost like rubric characteristics. So it might be, oh, I want to avoid this particular kind of toxicity. I want to give responses that sound very concise or that have this particular tone. Sometimes, though, it's even things that are one step higher. For example, let's say you're building a customer service chatbot and your goal is to drive conversions for as many users as possible. So maybe they're asking questions to this chatbot on your website when they have a question about the product. You could actually measure the fundamental business objective, which is the conversion rate that this chatbot is providing. And so you can see how is the conversion rate for the chatbot when it, for example, used a message from GPT-4 versus a message from Claude. You can do this at the most granular level where you can actually see for each chat session, what is the conversion rate. So you're able to use these proxy reward signals as a direct feedback to optimize the router to be aligned with your end business needs. This is something we're really excited about because we haven't really seen any tool out there that specifically aligns the quality, which is often a very, opaque and nebulous concept, with this specific business objective. So you can see like, what is the ROI of an additional unit of quality here in terms of, my dollar amount.
Right. And does this also take care of like hallucination aspect because you're validating the quality?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, one of the interesting misconceptions that I've seen in the space is people initially might think, okay, well, if I introduce other models, if I'm potentially routing between different models, well, now I have to worry about multiple models giving me hallucinations rather than one model. The really interesting thing is it's actually the opposite. The most dangerous thing, the most risky thing you can do is use one single model. And this is for a very specific reason. If you think about it almost as like, let's say, for example, you have a 10% chance of a hallucination when you're just sampling from one model. It's going to hallucinate 10% of the time. So if you just use one model, you're getting like a 10% hallucination rate. Now, let's say you introduce a bunch of other models and they also only hallucinate, 10% of the time. Well, now, if you're able to determine which is the best model to send to, then your chance of hallucinating ends up being 1 over 10 to the x, where x is the number of models that you have. So it actually decreases exponentially. You can actually look at this like statistically. So the safest thing to do, if you have a good routing system that can determine the right model, is to have as many possible backups as possible. Because even one model does hallucinate. Not only hallucinate, but there's issues with outages. So even like the most state-of-the-art providers like OpenAI can actually have significant outages and downtime. They've been down for like an hour, 2 hours at a time. And having backups, having alternatives that you're using, and using not just any alternative, but the next best alternative, which is what we allow you to find at Martian, is going to be a huge step up in terms of the reliability and confidence and uptime in your system.
Absolutely. That's very well said. So let's say that people are really interested and they understand the importance of quality and hallucination that your product delivers. What about another concern that a lot of companies have is the data privacy and ethics issue? Like most of the companies are very hesitant to even use these LLMs because of that aspect. So let's say if we want to approach you and say like, hey, my data is very, privacy is my prime concern. So how would you solve that?
Yes. Yeah, this is a great question. And actually, some of our earliest adopters are companies in some of the most regulated spaces, for example, financial services, where they
Right.
have some of the strictest requirements in the world. But they actually see that as a very strong reason to use Martian.
Mhm.
And I'll go into why that is. There's a bunch of pieces here. So we have a very flexible deployment offerings that we have. So we have like a developer plan that you can just call and route models on our servers. But we also offer the ability to have dedicated instances and deploy inside your VPC. So we have deployments where we don't see any of the data that you have. It can be deployed completely in your own VPC, and you don't have to worry about any data leakage or any of the other concerns from that. And this is something which actually enables something very powerful for those who are very conscious about data privacy. In addition to the fact that, and we obviously offer very strict agreements about where we're using the data. So if we're using data to train a router, it's only a custom router for you. It's not being used for any other company. But like there's a number of current challenges that I think are from a privacy standpoint that the current generative AI ecosystem has that are actually solved from a routing standpoint. So one is that you often have companies who have a particular ecosystem. Let's say, for example, they're using AWS, but they really like OpenAI.
Yeah.
So then they have to go and switch and support OpenAI Foundry and change their
Right.
entire infrastructure to Azure. And that ends up being very difficult. And it also introduces a bunch of other compliance hurdles.
Right.
Part of the reason that these companies make the switch, though, is they see that there is ultimately higher quality in their use case for using OpenAI. But one of the value props of Martian is that you can get much higher quality without the need to go and switch to a particular model. So it's almost like if you had like GPT-4, GPT 4.5 in your pocket, but you had it using a much more limited set of models.
Yeah.
And in that sense, you can stick to models which fit your particular deployment needs, whether that's, for example, you're in AWS, or you might, some companies, they only want to use, open source models that are fully on-prem. And those models are not as good typically as the newer closed source models. But through routing, you can kind of close the gap. You can imagine that as like bridging the gap to get you to that closed source, less secure model capabilities. And even when you're building, for example, your own internal models, if, for example, you're fine-tuning an open source model or pre-training your own model, that's something that a lot of companies are focused on too, is, you never know, you don't want to be too locked into one provider. We saw this, for example, in the cloud space, where a lot of companies became locked into a particular cloud provider, and then rates started really increasing. This is also something that Martian is designed to help with, is avoiding vendor lock-in with a particular model provider, because we can get you better quality from all the different models. And whenever new models come out, we can make it so you can deploy them with confidence. Even when you have your own model, you can put that into production. And one of the hesitancies that people had, for example, with putting models into production is, what if it hallucinates? Like a good example of this is, like, I think Google lost, it was billions of dollars because Google Bard got some question wrong when they were demoing it. And I think that's the fear that a lot of companies have internally of like, well, I don't want to put this out there because of that. But part of the problem is, in order to get better models, you need to be able to put your models out in production and have users using them, so you get more data on what the models are good and not good at, and you can then improve the models in accordance with that user data. But if you don't put it out there, you don't get that user feedback. So how do you do both? How do you avoid the risk of a model embarrassing itself because you put it out there, but still get lots of data that comes from putting models out there? If you have a system like Martian that's able to route away from your model when it's going to mess up, then you can put it out there with a lot more confidence. And you can actually look at, like, when we routed to another model as a data source to actually help you train your own internal model to get better. So we even have companies we're working with that are, their end goal is to build their own model, but Martian is a really powerful wedge to get them to the point that that model is up to par with the other models that are out there.
That's a very good point that I think a lot of people are not aware of, like the vendor lock-in thing that you mentioned. I think a lot of companies struggle with that. So yeah, it's a really good advantage to have. So is Martian also is just B2B, or can individuals also use it?
So we have a developer plan that people can use to play around with it, though the core offering that we're really providing, I think, is most realized when you're dealing with a production grade LLM system where you're running lots and lots of different requests. Although we do have a lot of benefits that developers enjoy, like we have the ability to add the latest models when they come out and call them through the OpenAI interface. All these providers have their own syntaxes, API requirements, and it becomes very difficult to keep track of how to call one versus the other and interchange between them. You might have to have 20 different API keys. With Martian, you have one account, one API key, and get access to
Uh,
all these models with the OpenAI format to play around with and experiment. So that's something that developers have really enjoyed.
that would be great. Yeah, yeah. Love to explore the developer platform.
Yeah.
All right. So moving on from your journey with Martian, in general, you mentioned that you've been an entrepreneur for a very long time. And
Yes.
could you tell us more about like some initial struggles that you've observed as an entrepreneur that young entrepreneur or aspiring entrepreneur should take a note of?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one high level thing is that it can be very easy to fall into the trap of just trying to have the greatest product, but not being very strategic about how you communicate its value. And I feel like that with Martian, where I know how much value we can provide to companies if we get in and we have the ability to show that.
Yeah.
But there's so many other, considerations that people have, and people are not always the most rational in how they go about thinking through decisions. So being very understanding of companies' needs, requirements, how they think about things, even if it might not always be the most rational or the most aligned with how you would think about it. I think that's very critical to ensuring that you can really calibrate your offering to be in line with what the market wants. And you don't fall into that trap of like, build it and then we'll come, and you don't get enough user feedback. That's definitely a piece that I've noticed. I think also I am very naturally like a perfectionist. That was a huge thing with my first company. So like I was so ready to just be like building, and I wanted everything to be done so well that I just didn't put stuff out there and iterate fast enough. And I think just getting over that almost like shyness to put stuff out there is
Yeah.
a huge thing, because often your standards on yourself are way higher than everyone else when they look at it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I know for a fact that a lot of engineers who try to become entrepreneurs have this mindset that they love their idea and they want to pursue it. But a lot of times I've seen people pivot their idea completely because of product market fit or, doing some user study. So that's something that engineers typically, don't want to do because they have a high belief in their idea. So I think one of the qualities that people is just something that I've observed is that being open-minded, right? Like you might have to change your idea altogether if that's not something that people want.
Yeah, and not just being open-minded about the product, but I think in general, it's a really important thing. So this
Mm.
kind of gets to the story of how I actually met my co-founder. So we both were doing research at Penn.
Mm.
This is where we were doing like work with generative AI applications. But the first time we actually connected was through a cold email. He actually cold emailed me out of the blue. This was during COVID, so people were remote, and he had just come back. He had previously been in Y Combinator with another company and was back in at Penn. And he was just looking to meet people during COVID because it was like the worst timing to come back and you're looking to like meet people, find a future co-founder. And so he just emailed people out of the blue. And I got the email and I took a call with him. And it ended up being like one of the best calls I've ever had. We were supposed to talk for 30 minutes. We talked for like 3 hours. But I think the ability to just be open to something like that. And, now I find someone who, I think will be like a lifelong partner, business partner and friend and collaborator. And that just came out of like the most spontaneous, serendipitous opportunity.
Absolutely. I agree. I agree. Right. So you also mentioned that, being open-minded in general is so important. Like how does one start and let's say somebody who's introverted and doesn't know how to go out there, how can they find their idea or pitch their ideas? Are accelerators the only way, or do you think there are other avenues that entrepreneurs or budding entrepreneurs who necessarily don't have that extrovertedness,
Mm,
how do they get started?
Gotcha. I think there's a couple things that were very helpful. I feel like, so I grew up in the Philadelphia area, and it's a very different environment from SF. And I remember the first time that I came to SF, and this is
Yeah.
something a number of people have described very similarly. They're like, this city changes you. And I think I had that same experience, that it changed my outlook on how I thought about building a company, the level of ambition I had, and the environment of just being around other people building companies. So I think even though I was definitely an introvert growing up, I think being around the entrepreneurs here, it changed and opened me up in a lot of ways. And I think that just being around other people like that
Right.
has definitely changed the characteristics that I had. I think both me and my co-founder, you were
Yeah.
naturally very like nerdy, intellectual
Right.
people,
Right.
but we have gotten so into what we built, and we have such excitement about really showing the world and bringing more people on board, that it becomes very easy, almost natural for us to go to events and meet people and talk about this. And I think some of that just kind of comes from being around the right environment. So one concrete suggestion I would say is like either move to SF or spend time in SF or really tight communities like that, because I think that will impact people, that will really impact you. Another thing is like, you want to actually be building something that you believe very strongly is going to have an extraordinary outcome and is going to be really beneficial to the person that you're helping, your customer. If you
Right.
feel like this is not that beneficial, you're not, maybe you'll feel a little bit hesitant to talk to them and get feedback. But if you feel like, you can imagine if you had like some pill that would cure cancer, well,
Right.
you're going to want like put that in the hands of anyone with cancer because it's almost your moral obligation to, or
Right.
you're doing them a disservice by not helping them. And I think it's the same thing with the product. If you believe in the product so strongly that it's helping people, and that's why it's important to be deliberate about what you build and not just, build something because, oh, you think that it's hot right now or it gets a lot of market attention.
Yeah.
But build the thing that you really resonate with. Well, then I think it almost feels like this, I want to just do whatever I can do
Purpose
because
of
this is
my
the right
life.
thing. Yeah.
Absolutely, agreed. Another question on building startups and building companies is like I've seen a lot of people who build great companies or have great ideas, but then they reach a stagnation point where how do I scale? Like I don't
Mm.
know, it's doing well, it has a couple of thousand customers, but how do I scale? So, is there any advice you've learned from all your entrepreneurial journeys, and especially with Martian, like when you started to where it is today? How do you scale? Is there any tips and tricks that we should be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing we discussed a little bit already is, tight iteration and putting stuff out there and getting lots of feedback. I actually had this attitude of like, I was, very young at the time. I was probably in like early high school or late middle school, but I was like, I'm not going to do any advertising for
Right.
the site that I had. And we still got to like millions of visitors, but I was like, I don't believe in ads. I feel like, why do I need to force this on people? It should be so compelling that they just use it right away. And I just realized that there's so many pieces missing from that because, obviously people they don't always have access to the right information, and they're not always rational and all of that. So that was one thing is like, that I would tell my younger self is like, don't be afraid to put something out there,
Hmm.
aggressively and to promote yourself. And I think that people are very receptive to that. Even like launching stuff on Twitter. And I'm someone who naturally never uses Twitter. But just sharing the work that we've been doing, I think has been really helpful. I think another thing is with like venture funding. I think that venture funding can be a really awesome tool. And I think that you have to have the right investors. I think we've been extremely fortunate to have some really, really world-class investors, not just in terms of like their brand and like the reputation of the firm, but as people that we respect, that we trust, that we can go to for advice and mentorship. And I think if you find the right people like that, that will help you because they've been there, they've gone through a lot of this stuff. And it also helps you because you get more plugged into the broader network. That's connected to my advice around moving to SF. I think the more you're around people who have done stuff like this, the more you can learn from them. So I think that's a big piece. And then as far as like how to actually raise the venture funding, that's kind of a longer discussion. But I think one big piece of advice I would give is just build relationships with as many people as possible. Because I think that people think that like raising venture funding is about like just showing up to a boardroom with like a killer slideshow and nailing your, 15-minute pitch. But
Yeah,
really what it is it's about getting to know people. And this is true not just of venture funding, but of sales and a lot of things in general. And I think the more you know people, the stronger your connections and relationships with people are, the more you learn, the more exposure you have. So I think that's the biggest thing there.
absolutely. I think, yeah, thank you for busting those myths about, how it's shown in TV shows and movies.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree, like being also relatively new to SF, I can completely echo the fact that how your mindset changes when you're around these people who are building companies. In fact, one of the first conferences I went to after moving SF, and I was talking to people and they asked me, hey, so what do you build? And I kept on talking about the work I do as on my 9 to 5, but then like, yeah, but what do you build? What are you building?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have an answer for that. And I realized, okay, everybody, irrespective of the fact they're doing a 9 to 5 or not,
Wow.
are building something.
Yeah.
It's a very motivating thing.
And it's a status thing too. In some ways, I feel like for certain people, they may not like that, but I think that when you align status with something that's actually beneficial to humanity, I think that can be a good thing. Like, I don't think people should worship status of like, how much money do you have or things like that. But if you're valuing it in terms of like, are you actually doing something impactful with your life, with your time? I think in some ways that can be a positive motivation.
Absolutely. Very well said. One last question before we move on to the next segment is a typical question like, generative AI has been the buzzword for the past
Mhm.
3 years. And a lot of people are, again, like building stuff just because it is generative AI.
Yeah.
In that, do you see generative AI to stick on for a long time, or is it gonna go away like, metaverse or something?
Yeah, no, it's funny because part of the thing that when I was looking at like with the investment company that I didn't like about because we were looking at like investing in cryptocurrencies. This was like right before the ICO boom, and it felt like very hypey. And I didn't like that because I didn't feel like it was based on substance. But the distinction is I think that not that there aren't there are certain valuable applications with crypto, but it was very, very diluted. And I think it became even more so over the next like 4 years.
Right.
One thing I will say though with generative AI is I think there's a lot of signs that this is based on very strong substance. I think one of the best indications is if you compare, for example, in the crypto space, what percent of CEOs, executives of companies are adopting crypto versus adopting generative AI, there's like a monster difference. I think these numbers are probably old, but it was something like 80 or 90% of all executives at companies are either piloting generative AI technology or they have that on their roadmap. So we've seen a massive industry adoption of generative AI. And I think that that's a very strong sign that this is something that's really rooted in substance and here to stay. And I think that if you look at the trajectory of the models and the features, I think there's also a lot of really exciting signs for optimism. To kind of share some like predictions also about the future, I think agents are going to become increasingly more popular and an increasingly broader part of generative AI use cases. So it's not just going to be, I'm going to have this quick, summarization script that goes and summarizes something, but actually you're going to have these systems take actions in a more autonomous manner. And they may take many, many steps of reasoning and processing and interface with other applications. This is also an area we think routing is going to play a huge role because you're going to be dealing with a very large diversity of data and inputs and requests and stuff like that. So I think that that's going to be a big thing in the future. And I think that generative AI absolutely is here to stay. I think like every, you could look at, for example, the dot-com bubble, and there was definitely a bubble, but, the companies like, Google were definitely there to stay. And so, yeah, I'm sure that people will hop from one thing. There are always going to be hot trends, but I think that the broader, in the same way that with, the dot-com bubble, the internet was this very substantive technology that still is hugely impactful for us. I think you're going to absolutely see the same thing with generative AI. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. It's going to stay here for a while, whether we like it or not.
But
And
I will say there was a point when when we started building generative AI, nobody was really taking that seriously. This was seen as this like random niche field. I remember we even had to explain to VCs like, why do LLMs have an economic value and what even is an LLM versus like existing tech. And there was a moment where all of a sudden with ChatGPT everything just blew up and it was like, oh God, well now everyone is going to be in this space, which is cool, but there's also going to be a lot of people that are in it for the wrong reasons because it's hot. And now every time I introduce that I'm building generative AI, people are going to look at me like, oh, this guy was just like chasing hype, chasing whatever the hot thing is. So almost like preface my conversations with, I was doing generative AI research, back in 2020. So yeah, you don't get that label, but it's been
true. I heard like, the YC batch last year, every 80% of startup pitches were like, I'm building this application which is powered by generative AI. And then, the VCs were like, oh my God, another Gen AI startup.
Yeah. Yeah. It's crazy. There's like the dilution that comes from everyone going after the same thing.
Yeah.
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 But I think that if you really talk to people, you can get a sense of like who is really serious as a builder. I think that does, if you have if enough background knowledge and you have even like a 5-10 minute conversation, I think it can become pretty clear. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, that was great advice and great insights. Moving on to the next and final segment. It's called Rapid Fire, and I'm going to ask you some questions. You have to
Okay.
immediately, first thing that comes to your head without thinking too much.
Hmm.
All right. First question. What's your go-to tool for staying productive?
Roam Research.
Okay. Now, do you mind sharing what it does?
Yeah, it's like knowledge management platform. There's a couple other alternatives out there. I was really interested in like how we can augment human intelligence. And this is something which Rome was one of the first tools out there that did this. And so I've been using it for a very long time. I think it's a really powerful product. And that was one thing which also it kind of like there was a very popular phase of like note-taking apps and stuff like that. That was really intriguing. But I think that there was actually a lot of substance that even got missed in that phase of people just like going and using these tools. But there's a really interesting like productivity methodologies that people have come up with for how to like organize their like task lists and to-dos. One is called Getting Things Done. I think it was originally a book by David Allen. There's also this method called the Zettelkasten. And I feel like Rome, I was kind of building my own tooling internally to do this. And I kind of had to like create these really complicated workflows and figure out how I could build this myself. And I remember I came across Rome and I was like, wow, this is like exactly what I was looking for, but someone actually built it. And it was like, okay, now at first it felt like there would be too much labor to even create the system that I was looking to do.
Yeah.
But because it was almost like creating a whole startup. But my goal wasn't to do a startup there. It was more of like a personal thing. And I was like, well, actually, no, this is like the infrastructure. It was almost like having like an IDE for programming. So
Wow. Okay,
yeah.
definitely check it out.
Yeah.
Who or what inspires you the most as a founder?
Definitely my father. He was the one who got me interested in the very first website I did for American Ninja Warrior. He introduced me to the show. He had his own blog where he would cover politics, and I did like the SEO for him. So that was also how I got interested in like websites and optimization. And he's had a huge impact on just like I think he was also a lawyer, and so he had a very strong sense of like justice and standing up for what was right, even if it meant like putting himself under fire and dealing with people who were like often very twisted in their own actions. So I think he gave me that sense too of like there's a lot of problems out there in the world, and there's a lot of like flaws with the current system, and don't be afraid to challenge the system. I think part of being a good entrepreneur is you have to have a sense that like the system is broken and that you are the solution to that. If you just have faith in the existing systems that are out there, then you won't have the gall and like the chutzpah to actually go and challenge that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, the first principle.
Mm-hmm.
What do you consider your biggest achievement with Martian so far?
That's a good question. I think one big thing for Martian is we had to create our own category. When we did model routing, that term didn't exist. And we created the first commercial model router, and we like coined that term and everything. And people initially looked at it as like, huh, like what's a model router? Never heard of this, because I think for a lot of people building companies, they're doing something that's like already been done, but they do like a slight variation. Whereas to your point about first principles, we had to basically do this from first principles, knowing what we knew as both researchers and past entrepreneurs, what would the most valuable thing be in the AI space in the long term. And we essentially created that category. I think one thing which was really awesome to see was the kind of the validation that we had created our own category. So CB Insights released this list of the top 100 companies in AI,
Right.
and they created categories for different companies. And they mentioned Martian on the list of top companies, but the really cool thing was that they specifically created the category model routing, which of course was this concept that we had created. So it was like we didn't just make the list, but we created the whole category of the field. And I think that was a really proud thing for us, is because we want to stand by what we know will be really valuable, even if the rest of it, just like how before ChatGPT, there were lots of LLMs out there. People just didn't realize that they had the kind of value that they did. So it's like we want to be the kind of people who could have had ChatGPT before ChatGPT and had the conviction to stick with it, because that one day people will catch on and see how extraordinarily valuable it is.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Who is your favorite entrepreneur and why? I mean, somebody apart from your father.
That's a good question. Okay, I'm gonna go with my co-founder Yash. But that comes from not just working with him, but from his past companies. Because I think for me, he had a very similar trajectory in life where he had to really figure out what were the most important things that he was working on, and be very deliberate about doing that. And he had like several past companies, and he loved building companies, but he didn't just want to build a company for the sake of building a large company. He wanted to build the company that would be like the most high leverage thing to spend his time on.
Makes sense. Yeah, similar values like you. What emerging technology are you most excited about for Martian's future?
We have this concept, this technology that we created called model mapping. The idea is that we can take a model and transform it into an alternative representation. And this is actually core to how we actually do the routing itself, is take these models and turn them into an alternative representation that lets us predict the expected quality of the model. But there's some really, really powerful applications on top of this. So we are actually developing a technology, which we've already proven this out for small models, that turns a transformer, which of course is this giant black box that you don't really know what's going on inside of it. It's kind of like the brain. Like if someone has some sort of, they're a really, really great, math genius. We don't really know like what specific neurons are responsible for that. Why were they like that? They're giant black boxes. we are actually able to take the transformers and turn them into a fully interpretable program. You can think of it like a Python script. So we can actually take a transformer and turn it into Python, where you can go and you can look at it and know, okay, here's the exact lines that are responsible for a particular behavior. This is a method that we were able to develop, and we have some really, really exciting work that we're going to be putting out there and publishing on this. But the really, really impactful thing here is what happens when you can turn something from a black box into a white box. You can imagine, if you're able to find like the neurons that made someone like a math genius, if you could take those neurons and then put them into someone else's brain. Not that I'm advocating for like, modifying people's brains, but in the case of like LLMs that are not humans, you can imagine taking like that specific characteristic, or let's say, it was something else that maybe they were really poor when it came to their social skills. You might be able to change it and fix the problem that happened. Well, we can do the same thing with models. So this would actually be a way to provably eliminate hallucinations. And in an even more broad sense, the way I like to think about this is the most powerful transformations in any one field are when you can go from alchemy to chemistry. Right now, we're in the alchemy phase of generative AI, where we have these models, we can throw some data at them to hope that they get better, and we can change how we prompt them. We can put some post hoc guardrails that change what happens after the fact, but we can't really engineer them the way you can with chemistry. And our goal at Martian, this actually is how we got the name Martian, is to understand intelligence such that we can go from the alchemy phase of AI to the chemistry phase of AI.
Okay, I have a follow-up question on that, but we'll talk about afterwards. Last question is, how do you maintain work-life balance as a founder?
That's a good question. I think I like to reframe it, instead of work-life balance, it's work-life blend. So I think that I think the thing that I want, I think where a lot of my happiness and my fulfillment comes from is from doing work for a really, really strong purpose. It's kind of like when you're like building something as an engineer. I feel like some of the most fun times come from that like satisfaction of building this really awesome thing that you've constructed. And I think for me, that thing that I'm building is Martian. And so I would much rather, have my time, my work spent doing something I really, really enjoy, that I'm just totally immersed in it, as opposed to kind of viewing it as something that I need to like only do in a particular time and like silo it. Not that I'm like working, 100% of the time, but I think the biggest thing is finding the line of work and the right business where you feel like, oh, I just want to work on this all the time. Because it's a huge gift. I remember I read a recent article about someone who had sold their business for a ton of money, and they went and they did some like really awesome things, traveled the world, and they basically came back and they were like depressed because they're like, what's next? I don't have that thing to do. So I feel like the way, having work and building a business is a real gift. It's a real prize to treasure. It's not the kind of thing that I want to just go and like sell it away, because then I feel like you're actually giving up something really awesome. And of course, I sprinkle in like I'll go for runs sometimes, stuff like that. Surfing occasionally on the weekends. So I do have like other things that I like to do for fun on the side. But I think the biggest, like most fundamental piece is really finding the most meaning and enjoyment from the work you do.
Absolutely. Very well said. I've seen similar examples of people like, hey, when I want to retire by 30 or 40, and they set age, and then when they actually retire and they travel and do all these fun things, and then like, what's the purpose of life? Like, you can't do this forever. You need a